So the convention begins May 1787, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. How did things get set up? Well, Washington was made president of the convention. He did not get involved in debates. He basically sat on an elevated platform and made sure that people behaved themselves. He talked a little bit, but not a whole lot. Security was put in place because it was decided that the proceedings of the convention would be conducted in secret. Why the secrecy? Well, because an attempt was going to be made to get rid of the Articles of Confederation instead of just modify them and come up with an entirely new constitution. This made some of the delegates kind of nervous because that's not what they thought they had signed up for. Nevertheless, the idea of secrecy seemed to be a good one at the time. Guards were posted. The delegates swore not to reveal what went on in the convention. The delegates were basically deputized into what was called a committee of the whole, where basically everybody was on the committee, all the delegates. And that way they could come up with ideas and things like that and not be wedded to them, but allow people to be heard and make proposals and that sort of thing. And so then the committee of the whole would then take the proposals and so forth and then present them to a committee for evaluation. There would be debate, that sort of thing. There was trouble brewing, and one part of that trouble had to do with the conflict between the big states and the little states. I mean that by population. Things were different then. Virginia was a big state at the time, whereas New York was considered a small state. So things were different. But basically, under the Articles of Confederation, every state was equal. The big states wanted to put an end to that. And this conflict between the big states and the small states almost torpedoed the convention, but they got it worked out. It got worked out really through the structure of the legislative branch of government. Basically, what would happen is that in the Senate, each state would be equal and have 2 senators. Now, at that time, in the early days of the Constitution, what they had happened was that the state legislatures, not the direct vote of the people, chose the senators. So that was the Senate. In the House of Representatives, every state would be entitled to 1 member of the House of Representatives, but states with greater population could have more than 1 representative. So that satisfied, to an extent, the big states' complaint, that there, at least in the House of Representatives, there was not that equality that you had with respect to the Senate. And it was established that financial and funding bills, in other words, the money aspect of things, that would have to be started in the House of Representatives. It was provided that in the event that states' population shifted, that they would have it reevaluated every 10 years with a census, and if the population shifted, so would the representation in the House of Representatives. Now, the 3 branches of government did appeal to many at the convention. The idea of having your legislative branch and an executive branch and a judicial branch with checks and balances became pretty popular. There was concern, though, about what would be the power of the executive branch. I mean, they were concerned about, all the power being invested in a king or a queen. And so it was a president going to be a king or a queen by another name. Now, one thing that helped the process is everybody knew who the first president was going to be. It was going to be Washington. So they knew that he would not be a king as far as that was concerned. But there was an argument about should there be a single executive or should it be a panel or what should it be? They finally resolved it into being a single executive. In the judiciary, it was proposed and approved that there would be a Supreme Court. And that Supreme Court would be required. That the legislature, if they wanted inferior courts, they wanted courts other than the Supreme Court, they could do that by legislation. It also established that the Constitution, if approved, would be the supreme law of the land. In other words, this national government was going to have teeth. One of the failures at the Constitutional Convention, despite all the enlightenment, despite all of the brilliance that assembled there, they could not solve the slavery issue. They could not get rid of it. They knew they had a problem. They knew that to talk about liberty and have slave owners and people in states of slavery was a terrible contradiction, but they couldn't solve it at the time. So they did what politicians do, and that is try to put things off, in this instance for about 20 years, and see if they could come up with something at that time. So they moved on. Slavery would still be in effect if the Constitution was approved. The next interesting battle was this. What shall be the power of this national government versus the states? What powers shall it have? It was decided that the powers would be specified. This is where some of the real genius of the Constitutional Convention found its way into the document because of the tremendous effect it's had on the United States over the years. And basically, things such as control of currency, of what the money would be, the idea of seeking to have a national currency, a national standard, was very appealing to many. Control over the navigable waterways by the federal government would likely provide a method of taxation, and it would also prevent states from fighting over water rights. It was in one of the most sensitive issues, that of setting up a national military. It was decided that ultimately the national government ultimately would have control over all the military, and that the President of the United States, a civilian, would be the commander-in-chief. So control over the military. Foreign affairs would be under the control of the national government. Bankruptcy law would be under the control of the national government. Intellectual property law would be under the control of the national government. And interstate commerce meaning business, but the notion of control over interstate commerce would be a federal matter. These, if you notice, these are kind of business-oriented things, but they had a tremendous impact down the road. Think about the fact that we in the United States, having had a national currency for a long time, And then you look at Europe and what they had to go through to get a unitary currency, the euro, if you will, the effect on the sovereignty of these countries and so forth, where we have had that advantage. And think what it means. Think what it means to be able to go to any state in the United States, and because we have the same currency, all the transactions are seamless. This was a brilliant decision, and it brought the country together. One thing that the Constitution was lacking, based upon its critics, was the lack of liberty rights that were in the body of the original draft of the Constitution. Even England had a Bill of Rights, and it seemed to many to delegates and later people who were seeking to decide whether or not to approve the Constitution, it seemed sensible to have specified liberty rights in the Constitution. There were various arguments against it, such as, well, if you list those rights, does that mean those are going to be all your rights? Aren't you limiting what your rights would be? What about natural law provides your rights. Ultimately, by September of 1787, when the Constitution was ultimately adopted by the delegates, there was no Bill of Rights. There were some liberty rights in the body of the 1787 draft, but there was a lot that wasn't there. So, how was the Constitution to be approved? It provided that there would be state conventions, and these state conventions would debate whether or not to adopt the Constitution, and when a certain majority of the states had approved it, then it would be effective. And so the situation was that it had to be approved by not just a simple majority, but more than a simple majority of the states by state conventions. So we're going to stop here and come back and talk about the issue of ratification of the Constitution.